Well, let's bring in two experts to help us continue to break down what's happening in Washington. Sahar Aziz is a professor of law at the Rutgers Law School, and she joins us now live from New York. And we also have Alan Barron in Washington. He's a former special impeachment counsel to the House of Representatives. I'm going to start with you, Alan, because we've been talking a little bit about the options here for the House. And there is the possibility that they could impeach him. They have this vote now, but then they decide not to actually go to a Senate trial. Talk us through what the options are there a little.
Well, I think I threw that bomb onto the table a couple of appearances ago. Yes, there's nothing in the Constitution that says you must now proceed to present the articles of impeachment to the Senate. And unless the Senate receives articles of impeachment on which to operate and function, they really have nothing to do. And it seems to me that it may well serve the best interests of the country and of the House in light of the fact that they're being stonewalled with regard to certain critical witnesses, that they don't go rushing across the from one end of the Capitol to the other to present the articles. Take some time to continue investigating, maybe a subpoena, and if you have to slug it out in the courts in order to make the subpoena effective, well, now they may have time to do that. So that's what I think is at stake here, and I think it's a very interesting approach.
So I'm going to ask you for your take on that. Do you think that that's a real possibility, and how might that play out if they choose to go ahead with that?
Yeah, although legally they could pursue that route, I think politically the Democrats are trying to not make impeachment the key issue in the election season. And some analysts, including myself, believe that that's one reason why they're trying to get the articles of impeachment voted on before the holidays, and then they would proceed to the Senate, with everyone understanding that it's very unlikely the Democrats are going to get the two-thirds vote from the Senate. I think even if they did more investigations or went to court to subpoena witnesses, I don't think that would change the outcome of the trial in the Senate. I don't think that you're going to get almost 20 Republicans, because you've got 67 votes that have to go to impeach, to convict on the articles of impeachment, and the Democrats only have 47 right now. So I think they're going to go all the way through and probably do it quickly, because then they want to shift to focusing on the elections.
Well, talking of that election, so if we have this trial start in the Senate in January, and then we watch that play out, and even if it is a quick trial, there have been various analysts who say that this could push public opinion further in favor of the president, galvanize the Republican Party, unite the right, and that this would actually not play out very well for Democrats at all. So if they don't think that they're actually going to succeed in removing him from office, why take this to the Senate at all?
Well, I think on the one hand, if you don't take it to the Senate, it makes it seem that this is not being seriously taken. You have Democrats right now on the House floor discussing that this is a threat to the Republic, that what Trump has done is a high crime and misdemeanor, and therefore for them not to go all the way through makes it more likely that the Republican argument that they're essentially, politicizing this process and they're trying to remove a president not through elections, a more plausible argument. So I think they have to go, they've committed and they have to go all the way. It was a risk that they took by going through the impeachment inquiry. It was one of the reasons why I think Pelosi was very hesitant in the beginning to even proceed to an impeachment inquiry. But now I think they're committed. The challenge here is, and it was a risk they knew from the very beginning, and the Republicans are trying to play off of it as well, is will these proceedings, both in the House and then the trial in the Senate, is that going to mobilize the Democratic base more, or is it going to mobilize the Republican base? Is it going to peel off independents for Democrats or peel off independents for Republicans? It is a gamble for both sides. The Republicans right now, if you listen to what they're saying on the House floor, there's a very common narrative. So one is, this is an attack on American democracy. This is an illegitimate process. This is an attempt to undermine, erode, and nullify American voters and their votes, and that in fact what the Democrats are trying to do is get rid of Trump extra legally or extra electorally through the impeachment process. If that narrative is successful, that could very well mobilize more Republicans in favor of Trump. But then the other side is that Trump is effectively a dictator. right? That he is engaging in authoritarian practices and abusing his power and abusing his office in order to get rid of his primary rival, which was Joe Biden. So this was a very specific, intentional move to guarantee that he would win the elections by taking out the most competitive candidate.
Alan, let me get your take on this. Is this the Democratic Party having to bite the bullet, bite the political bullet here in order to protect the Constitution as they're framing it?
I respectfully disagree with some of the points that the professor was making. I think that what Trump did here was so much worse than anything that Richard Nixon did in Watergate. They're not even comparable. Nixon, what happened was a third-rate burglary evolved into a cover-up, all of it domestic, didn't really go to the foundations of our political process. This involved a foreign country that was an ally, excuse me, and at war with the Russians. And the President of the United States basically blackmailed them, or tried to, into helping him politically against a rival, probably his most well-known rival, or else he wasn't going to release the money that the both houses had appropriated for Ukraine. That is terrible. If a president can get away with something like that with no consequences, we have entered a very dark era in our political life.
Alan, you've been involved in a number of impeachment trials yourself. These were to do with federal judges. And I want to ask you about the threshold of evidence that would need to be presented to senators in order for them to be pushed over the edge and have to potentially remove a president from office. Where is that threshold? Because we've seen quite a lot of evidence put out already over the House arguments. Is that enough?
The answer is yes. That very question arose in actually the first impeachment case I tried, involving then Judge Alcee Hastings. And his counsel made a motion in the Senate that the House would have to prove the facts beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, that is a standard that is employed in a criminal proceeding. The Senate took it up, and eventually they decided that it was up to each senator to decide for himself or herself what standard they wanted to apply. It could be that highest standard of the criminal law, or it could be a preponderance of the evidence, which is the more minimal standard used in a civil case. And I think what we can infer from that is that a trial, an impeachment trial, is not really anything really like a trial in a courtroom. I mean, think of the fact that all of the people involved, both in the House and the Senate, are politicians. They are not judges. They are not even jurors in the normal sense that we have a jury picked out of a jury pool. So it is a very political process, and I think we're seeing that very, very clearly in how partisan this particular impeachment inquiry has been and will remain.
Sahar, I'm going to bring you in here as well. What's your take on where we are in terms of the evidence? Because we've heard lots said in the House on both articles of impeachment so far. What happens when that goes to the Senate in terms of assessing that evidence?
Right. Well, first, I don't think that Mr. Barron and I are disagreeing in terms of the seriousness of Trump's actions. And I agree that what he has done is egregious. I think that it does meet the high crimes and misdemeanor. Obviously, the articles of impeachment vote is going to likely show that today. I think the issue is really whether or not they were going to take the impeachment, the articles of impeachment and the vote on it and take it to the Senate for the trial, and I think they will. But I agree that this is what happened is very serious. I mean, on two grounds. One is because you're dealing with a foreign government and the foreign interference in domestic politics, but I think more importantly, it's that he put his own personal, political, electoral interests ahead of national security. And that is exactly what the founders did not want a president to do, and that's precisely what impeachment is aimed to protect against. So I think that the allegations or the articles of impeachment are very serious. With regard to the evidence, notwithstanding that Trump effectively obstructed any attempt for the House, the committees, as well as the House itself to be able to gather evidence by telling his advisors, by telling members of the executive branch, appointees, not to respond to the subpoenas, not to testify, not to provide documents, which in and of itself is really dangerous for the rule of law in the United States, because what he's doing is he's telling Americans that this legal process is illegitimate, that you should not respect the law. Because I don't respect the law, you shouldn't respect the law. And this is part of his messaging from when he was a candidate, and it's gone through his presidency, which I think is the most nefarious part of his presidency, more than his specific actions, is the way that he attacks the judiciary, attacks judges, attacks the Congress, attacks legal processes. And the concern that I have, particularly as a law professor, is the generation that's coming of age right now under Trump. If that's what their perception is of our legal institutions, of our Congress, of the separation of powers, of the judiciary, then that will not fare well for the country when they grow up and think, oh, it's normal for the executive branch not to cooperate with Congress, not to provide the documents. But notwithstanding the obstruction of justice, I think those who did testify, it was very clear that there was a quid pro quo. It was very clear, and even Trump admits it to some extent. He just doesn't think that there's anything wrong with it. And that in itself is troubling, that he thinks it is all within the disagreement on policy for him to be able to pressure the Ukrainian government to open an investigation on the son of his political rival and on his political rival. And it is no coincidence that Biden, when he announced his candidacy, was at the top of the polls. So it's no coincidence that Trump felt threatened by him politically. This was not some random candidate who couldn't even get above 1% of the polls. So this was abusing his office to prepare for winning the elections. It's a form of cheating, for lack of a better term. And what concerns me is that the public that's listening to the Republican narrative and that's listening and reading the tweets by Trump, unfortunately, they're believing a lot of it. I mean, we already know he's got 25 to 35% of the population as his base. And he's using this as an opportunity to dig in his heels. So again, we've got a very serious rule of law problem that we'll have to address, even if Trump is removed, whether through impeachment or whether through elections.
And consequences from this whole process and the narratives that have been spun. Sahar Aziz there for us in New York, and we've also been talking to Alan Barron in Washington, D.C. We'll be coming back to both of you shortly, but we'll leave it there for now. Thank you.